There's a very specific sound that lives in the memory of Gen X. The click of a front door locking behind you, the hum of a television filling an empty house, the whir of a cassette rewinding with a pencil, the echo of your own footsteps in a quiet kitchen at 4 p.m. No text message asking if you got home, no GPS dot blinking on a map, just you and time and the understanding that you were on your own until dinner. That was normal. If you were born somewhere between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, childhood didn't feel curated. It felt unsupervised. You drank water from hoses that had been baking in the sun. You rode bikes for miles without helmets. You knocked on doors instead of sending messages. You vanished into neighborhoods and returned when the street lights flickered on like some ancient signal telling you it was time to go home. And now you are the parent who double-checks the group chat, who sets screen time limits, who refreshes a location app, who feels uneasy if your child doesn't respond within minutes. From roaming freely to monitoring carefully, from figure it out to text me when you get there. It looks like a contradiction, but it isn't. It's a nervous system that remembers. To understand Gen X parents, you have to understand the quiet psychology of independence. That wasn't optional. Many Gen X children were latchkey kids. That wasn't a dramatic label at the time. It was simply life. Divorce rates were climbing. Dual income households became necessary. Parents worked long hours. After-school programs weren't universal. You learned to heat leftovers, finish homework, and entertain yourself. Independence wasn't taught as a virtue, it was absorbed as survival. And survival-based independence feels different from chosen independence. When no adult is consistently available, you adapt. You stop asking for help as often. You manage emotions privately. You become competent early. You learn to solve problems without expecting backup. On the surface, that built resilience. But beneath that resilience was something quieter, a subtle loneliness, a subtle awareness that safety was not guaranteed, that adults were busy, that if something went wrong, you would likely be the one to handle it. Those experiences don't disappear, they get stored. Attachment theory tells us that early caregiving experiences shape how we perceive security. Many Gen X children were loved deeply, but often in households strained by economic pressure, social change, or emotional fatigue. Support existed, but it wasn't always emotionally immersive. Feelings were acknowledged quickly, then redirected. You're fine. Walk it off. Don't make a big deal. As adults, this produces a fascinating blend. Part self-reliant, part hyper-aware. You don't panic easily, but you anticipate worst-case scenarios. So when Gen X becomes parents, something instinctive activates. Not control for control's sake, but protection. The child who once carried a key on a shoelace now carries an app that tracks their own child's location. The freedom they experienced was thrilling, yes, but it also meant navigating fear alone sometimes. And that memory sits quietly in the nervous system. It's not that Gen X parents don't believe in independence. They do. They value it intensely. But they also remember how heavy it felt at times. They remember walking home in the dark and pretending not to be scared. They remember being sick alone until a parent got off work. They remember figuring out emotional confusion without anyone translating it for them. So when they hover, it's not because they forgot their freedom. It's because they remember the parts of it that were hard. There's a psychological mechanism called reaction formation. When we experience something painful or anxiety-provoking, we sometimes respond by creating the opposite for others. If childhood felt chaotic, we build structure. If it felt lonely, we stay involved. If it felt unpredictable, we over-prepare. For some Gen X parents, the unsupervised summers of the 1980s are painted in golden nostalgia, but nostalgia often edits out the vulnerability, the scraped knees without comfort, the quiet anxiety no one named, the emotional conversations that never happened. So they overcorrect gently. They build calendars, they attend games, they text reminders, they become present in ways they didn't always experience. History intensified that vigilance. Gen X entered adulthood during seismic shifts, the Cold War's shadow, economic recessions, corporate layoffs. The message was subtle but persistent. Security is fragile. Then came Columbine, then 9/11s. These were not distant headlines. They were adult awakenings. Gen X was old enough to understand mortality, instability, and unpredictability in real time. Large-scale trauma doesn't always create visible panic. It often creates baseline vigilance, a low hum that says, "Be prepared." Safety becomes something you manage, not assume. So when Gen X parents install safety apps or insist on detailed plans, it's not irrational fear. It's memory layered with collective trauma. The world changed during their formative adult years, and that shift altered their perception of risk permanently. Add technology to the equation. Gen X remembers life before the internet, before algorithms, before constant connectivity. They remember boredom as a daily state, long car rides staring out windows, Saturday mornings with nothing planned, research done through encyclopedias and card catalogues, social mistakes that ended when you went home. Now they are raising children whose mistakes can be permanent and searchable, whose social comparison never shuts off, whose attention is pulled by devices engineered to hold it. This creates something like nostalgic mourning, not a desire to go backward, but a recognition that their children's environment is fundamentally different. They remember what it felt like to be unreachable, to have privacy, to exist without an audience. So when they argue about screen time, it's rarely about control alone. It's about protecting cognitive space, protecting innocence, protecting mental quiet. Economically, Gen X learned skepticism early. They watched parents lose jobs. They saw pensions disappear. They learned that loyalty to institutions was not always reciprocated. So when their children speak about dreams, Gen X responds with practical questions. What's your backup plan? How will this sustain you? It can sound harsh, but it's protective realism. Preparation equals safety, and safety equals love. Emotionally, Gen X parenting exists in transition. Many were raised with authority-driven models where respect meant obedience, and emotional conversations were brief. Now they are parenting in a culture that values emotional intelligence and validation. They don't want to repeat silence, but they weren't deeply modeled vulnerability, so they learn on the fly. They validate, then pivot to problem solving. They struggle sometimes between toughness and tenderness. And when they fall short, guilt hits hard, because many carry an unspoken mission. Do better than what I had without losing the resilience it gave me. Many Gen X parents are also part of the sandwich generation, raising teenagers while navigating medical appointments for their own parents, balancing tuition and caregiving, managing careers in an unstable economy. The weight is quiet but heavy. They rarely dramatize it. They keep moving. But inside, they are stretched across time. For all the contradictions, Gen X parents are remarkably adaptive. They grew up analog and became digitally fluent. They inherited emotional restraint and are trying to cultivate emotional openness. They experienced instability and chose structure. That is not hypocrisy. It is evolution shaped by memory. If you were raised by a Gen X parent, you might see structure before softness. But beneath that structure is deep commitment. Beneath the vigilance is someone who remembers being on their own and decided you wouldn't feel that same uncertainty if they could help it. And if you are a Gen X parent, you are balancing worlds, holding nostalgia in one hand and responsibility in the other, honoring independence while guarding safety, navigating a world that feels faster and louder than the one that raised you. The child who once came home to an empty house now makes sure someone answers the phone. The kid who once wandered freely now builds guardrails carefully, not because they forgot their childhood, but because they remember it completely. And if this video felt familiar, share and subscribe.